Hey guys, so I decided to give it a few days before I record this video, so my voice would be a little less coughy. I still have a bit of a cough, but I haven't been coughing very much all day, so I figured now is the time to talk about summoning. We're going to talk about all of summonings. That means the core rulebook, Arcana Exit, and I even have a character sheet open this time so I can point out where stats might go and stuff over here. But first, we're going to talk about summoning and how it works. This chart right here is your most important guide to knowing what you can do as a summoner. There's a chart, I believe, just on the next page or a page after that. 1 second, let's find it. Here we go. And this chart is your second most important chart. First, though, I'm going to explain the first chart, and then we'll get back to the second one. So, to explain this chart, it tells you how much the difficulty of a skill check to summon a level of a creature, and how much Xeon it costs, how hard it is to control it, how much Xeon that costs, how hard it is to bind it, how much Xeon that costs, and finally, how hard it is to banish it, how much Xeon that costs. The most difficult thing to do is to control something, the easiest is to banish it. Very simple. What this kind of does, though, is it means that if you're the paladin class who gets the banish skill 1-to-1 and is a warrior, it is much easier for you to banish the things a summoner summons unless they control that creature and make them familiar. So let's explain all 4 things you can do in summoning, based on this summoning table so far. The first thing you can do is summon a creature from level 0 to 15. If the creature is above level 15, you cannot summon it, and certain creatures are immune to summoning. As a general rule of thumb, you can only summon beings between worlds, and your summoning abilities only affects beings between worlds. The beings between worlds who are immune to summoning effects are constructs, the undead generally, and spirits generally. I use the word generally because undead creatures are immune to it, but there are some spirits and some technically not undead creatures that might not be immune to it. It depends on the creature you're using, but basically, rule of thumb, if it's a zombie, you can't control it, bind, or summon it, or banish it. But if it's like a vampire, then maybe you could. It's a bit of a weird wiggle room up to your GM discretion. But the creation of the Black Sun and those walked among us would be into the summoning abilities, which is why they are so dangerous. You can obviously control all beings between worlds. Now, summoning is very self-explanatory. You summon a creature to the world. Control is not as explanatory. When you control a creature, it allows you to subjugate a being and force it to obey your orders. This does not mean the creature is loyal to you by any means. And a creature you control, if you control it for a long period of time without forcing it to be your familiar, will eventually potentially plot to kill you to regain its freedom, or find other means to gain its freedom. Because you order it not to kill you, then it cannot kill you directly. But that does not stop it from convincing your comrades or other NPCs to kill you. Binding a creature is trapping it inside of an item, basically. Uh, it's very common for summoners to bind their familiars to an item, so that if they were going through a settlement and they were worried about the Inquisition, they could hide their familiar in a weapon of sorts and it would not be detectable. You also need binding to make a familiar bond. Banish is very self explanatory. It allows you to force a creature back to its home world. Now, keep in mind, that means they go back to the wake. They're not actually dead or anything. So, if you're dealing with a creature that's capable of going between the wake and the real world, Banish is not very useful. Unless you're just trying to buy some time for you to run away or something. Uh, Keep in mind that there are certain spells that turn you into a being between world and therefore make you susceptible to these abilities. So be careful, wizards out there who want to use the Chimera spell. You might get wrecked. Uh, if there are 2 summoners trying to do the same thing to the same creature, the better summoner always wins. That's what this section's about. And then this goes into the summoning rules. Uh, the more you know about a creature, the better. As long as you know a bit about it, like its typology, you know, what it looks like, its like general name, then you can summon it without any penalties. If you only have like a rough idea, like you're summoning like a dog-like creature, and that's all you know, that's a negative 50. You always get benefits for having additional information. Control, there's no special penalties or negatives. You just do it. And this is where it tells out where if you're not careful, your controlled creature might try to betray you, basically, is where that rule I just mentioned was earlier. Binding is very simple. The only thing you know about it is that the presence of the object must be greater equal to or greater than the creature you're binding within it. So you can't bind a magical ghost of some description into a dagger unless that dagger has a lot of presence. That's why summoners like having a lot of high quality equipment to bind creatures inside of them for later use. And finally, this is where we are talking about spiritual bonds with creatures as well, is in this part of the book. Binding is how you will eventually make it familiar. There's banishing here. It's very self-explanatory. They go away. I'll get into familiar bonds when I talk about in the book. Uh, you can summon multiple beings in one turn, and you summon them all one at a time. You spend each Xeon point individually. The only downside to doing this is, sorry, is that you can take a negative 50 penalty to summoning each individual creature. A ritual is how you will generally summon creatures, because if you do not use a ritual to summon something, you get a huge negative 100 penalty to your skill check. That's not very good at all. And when you summon a creature, you only have one turn to prep to control it if you want to control it. So, generally for rituals, you're going to want to spend time to at least get that 0 or find other means to ignore these penalties. If you're planning getting a familiar, you're going to want to set up your ritual site as in a place where you can actually capture the creature and then go through the steps. You can alleviate some of these penalties by knowing the being's true name, which is difficult because knowing its true name is something it would not give you freely. Possessing an object that belongs to it, like an item, weapon, something that it holds dearly, or possessing a part of it. So let's say you were fighting some sort of demon and you managed to cut his arm off before he fled back to his home realm. You would then have an extra benefit of plus 20 to summon him because you have his arm. And this is it explaining what these actually mean. So, having a group of summoners is one way to give you additional benefits to summoning. For every summoner you have, as long as they're within 50 of your skill that you're using, they'll give you up to 150 bonus, basically. Plus 10 for each extra summoner. Though every member of your summoner circle must invest 10 Xeon into it. This just says that creatures of high genosis are immune to summoning effects. Basically, if it has 40 or greater, it can't be summoned. If it's 35 or greater, it cannot be bound. And at 30 or greater, it cannot be controlled. So keep that in mind when you're summoning stuff. Uh, Superior feelings and resistance. It's kind of awkward to go through these rules. But basically, to keep it simple, normally a creature does not have an MR check against being summoned and stuff. But if they have special bonuses to their MR, it applies to their summoning difficulty. And also, if you bound a being, it does not regenerate Xeon. And instead, they regenerate Xeon by feeding off your own. So if your familiar is a wizard, you better make sure you have a lot of Xeon to keep it powered. You can specialize in being an elementalist and only summon specific elementals, giving you a plus 30 bonus to summoning abilities on them, but a minus 30 for any type empty, and a minus 60 to all beings that are the opposite of your element. Finally, we get to familiars. Oh, failure. I'll get to this table actually first before we go to familiars. This is why being a summoner is very dangerous. If you're not careful and planning ahead, you are very likely to get into these horrible, terrible situations where you summon a bunch of creatures you didn't want to summon who want to kill you, or basically all these more than 100 effects at the bottom of the charts instantly kill you, more or less. Because all of them take away all your Xeon, except for the control one. And, well, the summoning one instead summons your ass to some very powerful entities like the throne room, and he's gonna fucking kill you for interrupting his rest or enslave you or something. Uh, if you fail to bind to a creature, you're bound to the being that you were trying to bind, and therefore you now share your destiny with the creature. If it dies, you die, and all creatures that you have ever summoned or have bound or controlled are freed. And if they don't like you, guess what? They're probably going to murder you, which is bad. Also, looking at the previous one for bind as well, they also become immune to all your summoning abilities, so you're fucking dead. Literally all of them. All of your powers. Even the other ones we'll talk about later in the book, they would be technically immune to based on the wording of that, which is a little silly, but you're sure to fuck up that bad. For control, you become the puppet of the creature for the rest of your life, which means your character is dead. And if you fail to banish very badly, you lose all your Xeon, and instead summon forth a legion of similar entities, all of them more powerful and completely immune to all your banish ability. Now you might be like, why aren't you going for these other not so bad effects? Because the way it works is if you're a very careful summoner and you are making sure to not take any negatives and you're doing the proper research, you will never, ever, ever have to look at this table. If you are being reckless and you are summoning things without taking proper precaution because you're panicking or because you really need to summon the Arctic Chimera right now, that's the only time you have to worry about these tables. Next, we're talking about union bonds. First, the way union bonds work is the creature you're trying to make it familiar with must be within 1 level of you or 5 presence points if they have higher than normal presence. Only beings between worlds and spirits can become familiars. See how I said you can't summon spirits? There are some spirits that aren't undead. You can summon those ones. Once you have met those requirements, both sides must be willing, quote unquote. But there is nothing stopping you from first controlling the creature and forcing it to be a willing creature by having your control over it. You then must roll a bind check on the creature as if it were 2 levels higher, and you invest 10 times the Xeonic cost to finalize the bond. What does this mean, though? So, first off, you can also not just give yourself familiars, but with this same ability, you can forge familiar bonds between two other separate creatures. To maintain the bond, you spend half the cost in Xeon points that would be required to keep a being of that level bound. Because when you bind something, you must pay its binding cost per day, basically, like a maintenance for Xeon spells. And they are just automatically subtracted from your Xeonic regeneration. So if you're not a wizard or something, you can't really afford to have familiar. So you have a few powers from having a familiar. The first one is that when you level up, he levels up. The familiar, that is. This is the only way mechanically in the game to level up creatures, beings between worlds as companions. So this is a good bargaining chip for why a being between world might want to willingly become your familiar without having you to force them, is because these bonds can make them more powerful. And in theory, in the back of their head, if they become powerful enough, maybe they think they can break free from you in their own power without risking their own lives. As the master of the familiar, you're always aware of where your familiar is, and you can even sense things through the link of the familiar, using all of its senses, since now part of its soul resides within you. You can launch spells through your familiar by cutting your MA by half. And the downside of this, though, is familiar never recovers Xeon points by itself, but you can dole out a portion of your Xeonic regeneration to give Xeon to your familiar. Now, there is some other downsides to having familiar. So when your familiar is injured, you must roll a PHR check against twice the amount of damage your creature takes. You make this check once per wound. A normal failure only results in a negative 20 all action penalty, but it only goes down by 5 per hour. If you fail by more than 50, you fall unconscious. Now, if your familiar is damage resistance, you do it against 1/10 of the familiar's damage, which makes you safely immune to the first part of this rule, because unless you're fighting entities who are dealing over 1,000 damage, you will likely always pass the PHR check. Now, if your familiar dies, you just get the minus 20 action penalty no matter what you do. And you must make a PHR check against the damage that caused familiar's death or fall unconscious. If you fail by more than 60 points, you also die. The opposite is also true for your familiar, where if you take damage, it rolls the PHR check, and if you die, it probably dies too. Now you might be thinking, well, these 60 points penalties, they don't seem, failing a PHR check by 60 points, they don't seem that bad. Keep in mind though, this is the killing blow. This is the blow being dealt to your familiar after it's already been battered and wounded, and this is the one that finished it off. So likely familiar is having a negative 90 penalty to defend itself, and things have gone very poorly. Uh, it's likely this PHR check will be very high unless the character who killed it had a very low damaging weapon. But assuming even if it's like an average damaging weapon, the PHR check will be ridiculously high, and you and the familiar will likely die. Or at the very least, fall unconscious. Uh, you cannot voluntarily break this bond either, but there are other ways that you can break it. If you kill your familiar and manage to live, you could break the bond that way. And I get to see a way where a summoner could do it, where they like put the familiar in like a. This is gonna sound terrible, by the way, in some like horrible blender that only does 1 damage per turn, and just like slowly blend it to death in like chunks where your base PHR would be a success, and then you would kill it that way. If you cannot meet the daily Xeon requirement need to maintain it, so if there's Xeon regeneration is lower than the amount you must invest. Both you and the familiar suffer a negative 10 action penalty that goes up every day. And after a week of this happening, the bond is broken. However, if you do this, if this happens to you, you do lose 1 point of power forever. So also bad. Now, you might want to make sure your familiar doesn't get too powerful than you, especially if you bound to one who was 1 level higher than you. So you can desire to hinder the advancement of your familiar. Or if you can't afford the Xeon cost, you might want to be a level lower than you to make it cheaper to maintain with. So the next chapter has to deal with invocations. There's this whole blurb, but I'm just going to explain it by using an arcana as an example. For in the core rulebook, the only invocations are the arcana. And the first arcana happens to also be the best arcana. So to make a deal with arcana, first you likely need the occult skill to even know about them. But assuming you're a summoner, you likely have a high occult score. So you might first research the arcana to learn about them, and then once you do so, you may attempt to seal a pact with them. Each arcana has separate instructions for its pact. So the Fool's is very simple. He'll ask invokers to initiate and comply with the pact with another arcana. So that means to get the Fool, you have to get another arcana as well. So then you look through this list and you find one that that really appeals to you, that fits your character, is honestly the best way to do it. Keep in mind though that when you first invoke these creatures, that you still need to make the summoning check and pay the Xeon cost to actually summon the creature. to make your when you forge the pact, and then when you also seal the pact with it. So another common one that a summoner might get is the second one, the magician. It's the next easiest one to get. All you need to do is reach mastery and ability. That means getting a final score of 200 or greater. Now, normally you get to pick which ability it is, so you might say, I want to master summoning. And that's how you would do it. Very easy, you're a summoner, you put lots of points summoning anyway, so you'll reach mastery in that very quickly. And then you could seal the pact with the magician and the fool. The reason the fool is so good is because he eliminates all the penalties that involve summoning rituals and other summoning negatives. You just have no penalties, no matter how little time you invest. This means it's very good because you would summon the Fool. He's easy to summon, so you would not care about the minus 100 penalty because you, in this theoretical example, already have 200 summoning, so you summon the Fool, and then from there you can do whatever else you want to do. I recommend if you are any kind of summoner that you invest in getting the Fool if you want to summon things in combat quickly. If you want to go for more of the familiar route, then the Fool is not necessary, and neither are any of the Arcana. They're all very cool, and they can grant your character special abilities and benefits. I'll mention this now while I'm here that uh, in the Arcana exit book, where more of these invocations are added, they do also allow you to specialize into invocations, which lets you only have to pay half the cost for these Arcana and similar invocations. But if you do so, you cannot summon creatures normally. You can only use invocations and incarnations, which will be covered in the next book. The only thing to talk about with Arcana is there are normal Arcana and the reversed Arcana. The reversed Arcana generally ask you to do horrible, terrible things. Like the Fool Reverse just asks you to request a pact with the Arcana and fail to seal it. Like, fuck up. Or the Magician Reverse might ask you to summon a creature it tells you to summon and let it go wild in the world. You know, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Like enslaving people, and these are the evil Arcana, basically. And they have their own separate powers that tend to be a bit more offensively based, but also a bit more potent because they're harder to do. Makes sense. Now, before we go to the next book, I want to talk about summoning on the character sheet. So the only stat that actually matters summoning is power. Power is everything for a summoner because it dictates your magical accumulation. It dictates your stat bonus to summoning. It literally is everything you do. The rest of your stats don't matter for a summoner as much. If you want to be casting spells and being a summoner, though, you'd also want intelligence, obviously. The secondary abilities that matter for a summoner, and summoning in general, are generally occult, and maybe magical appraisal you have the gift, and that's it. Those are your basic skills for like that are non-supernatural. And then if we go down further to the actual, I hope this issue does have a summoning section. I'm pretty sure it does. Yes, here we go. Path magic and summoning. So you have the summoning skills. All of them are good. Here you can put your specialization. So you're an invoker or an elementalist or neither. These are the only 4 summoning skills. But you also need to invest into Xeon and magical accumulation, which is right down here on this sheet in particular. Keep in mind, though, this sheet is a little bit poor about it. There isn't a section for your regeneration or your magical regeneration because it should be separate. Because you can also buy regeneration multiples. If you are just going into normal summoning, I would recommend only getting regeneration multiples because they cost half as much, and all you care about as a summoner is how much Xeon you regenerate, not how much you can charge. You do not need to charge Xeon for any summoning ability. You just need a large Xeon pool to accommodate it. And now it's time for us to go to this book, Arcana Exit. So, summoning starts actually with some of the advantages in this book, to be honest. So, let's go back to the beginning of the book real quick. Enjoy the art as I scroll through it very quickly. Uh, a lot of this stuff isn't too important until we get to mass summoning rules, which are redone in this book. And this is where summoning begins. This, it tells you about the weird rules about something undead, and it opens up a bit more, saying, okay, you can summon undead, but it should be more difficult. It doesn't say how much more difficult, but they should be. And in this book, it allows you to summon the undead. Uh, this goes into more of the behavior of summoned creatures, what you should expect, and then finally it goes into mass summoning. We talked about it earlier, but they changed the rules in this book. So if you want to summon a lot of creatures, you must first be higher level than them, and very high level than them, like 5 or 13 levels above them, and it increases in difficulty based on the creature's level. So let's say you're level 6, and you just want to summon 2 level 1 creatures. That means it would be a +1 difficulty, so it'd be considered like if you like summoning a level 2 creature for all those things, and you could summon 2 of them at once. And you just treat it like a level 2 summon. And the same is for that for the whole chart. Eventually, though, if you're like a really high level character, you're summoning whole armies of these weaker creatures. And the next part I want to go to about summoning is the new advantages, actually. So, for the mass summoner advantage, it lets you cheat out having X levels for that chart, basically. So, if you really want to go into that, you take this advantage. The partial gift, or the incomplete gift, as it's called in this book, lets you take advantages that require the gift, like this one, and even lets you cast spells if you make a power check, but it only costs you 1 CP. So it's nice for a summoner who wants that improved magical regeneration. Sheely Essence is one you need, or it's not one you need at all. But if you want to go into Sheelies, which are a different kind of familiar, you can, and this is the advantage makes it better. I will talk about them when they come up. And finally, if you want to start off with a familiar, this is the advantage for you. It lets you start off with familiar. Cool stuff. So then it goes into Theorems of Magic, which I don't believe has anything about summoning. No. So the next part we go into from this point is invocations, actually, which we've already talked about. These invocations work just like the ones in the core rulebook, actually. However, these go into the Great Beasts, which are referenced in the previous book, but are not given mechanics at all. These guys work literally the exact same way. They give you a pact, you fulfill the pact, you get to use them. These guys are a lot more specific in their use, and there aren't very many generally good ones. It's all up to what your character would like do, and a lot of them ask you to do very difficult things or very morally questionable things, but they are generally more powerful. Like this guy Garuda asks you to literally kill a dragon and sacrifice its heart to him, and then when you do that, you get to use his power. You know, stuff like that. They come in minor, intermediate. I think there's even greater ones too. Let's see. But as you can imagine, the further you go along it, the more powerful they get. But they work just like normal invocations. There's just more of them now if you want to be an invoker and just invoke stuff. And then finally, at the very end, are the Trinity of Beasts. You can generally only have one of them, but just consider them like your super duper ultimate invocation that you get for being super duper powerful. They're not actually that end game. They're more of a mid game thing. I feel like when it comes to their packs, it just means you are directly serving one of these lords, one of these major beasts, and there are quite a few of them. Again, it's up to you and the kind of character you play to determine whether these guys are honestly like something you'd want to go for. Out of this list, though, the one that is perhaps the only one that's generally useful is the Seller. He is like a free invocation, and he just sells you shit. He has he is interesting, though his prices are based on DM being evil. Also, in this part of the book, some of these guys have different difficulties for their initial invocations, and also initial costs. But for some of them, they're like the exact same. So don't worry too much about it. Incarnations, however, are a lot different. If you're an invoker, you can still use these. They count as invocation. But instead of summoning something, you become the thing. So, depending on how long you want to be in this form, you can take a negative to the difficulty, or you can make it harder and be in that new form for longer. These forms are generally of heroes and villains from Anima's past. So this list is not comprehensive. The only requirements for something to be an incarnation is one, they must have been a relatively powerful creature. Two, they must have died dramatically. And three, they must have people must know about them. If they don't if no one knows about them, then it's impossible to invoke something. These are legendary heroes and villains, people who did terrible or great things. And depending on certain parameters that would make sense, that would make you more aligned or synchronize the creature or person, you'll get additional bonuses to invoking them. Like having their possessions, being like them, or having similar attributes to them. And when you invoke them, these have a hard level requirement. So to invoke the minor affinity of Link's Kate's Hex, the Shadow who brings death, you need to be level 4, make a 260 summoning check, and spend 400 Xeon. And when you invoke it, you get all of these abilities in the stat block, and these stats overwrite your current stats. So you would get 130 attack, 170 dodge, 120 initiative. You'd be able to Blood Rose, which is this weapon, and you would get these abilities. Very simple. And these incarnations also level up, sitting at level 4, level 8, level 12, as you can see. And as you get further along the tree of these guys, the more powerful they get. Generally, you'd have multiple incarnations because there are obviously some big level gaps. When you are using the level 4 affinity of Hex Kates and you're letting a level 7 creature, you're going to have a bad time. So I recommend if you want to use these, you make sure you have enough incarnations that cover up most of the level gaps in the game. There are a few level 2, level 1 ones that you can use. In fact, I think there's only one level 1 incarnation, yeah. Or 2 Year the White Lion, who is a pretty good, easy one to go for at the beginning of the game. Because our 2 Year the White Lion was like the pets of Zor and Giovanni, so learning about him is super easy, and he is very good in general. And he will cover you for the early game style incarnation. He should honestly be the first one the game shows you. to be honest. And then there are other ones, and to be honest, you should pick them based on what you like and what you want to do, and also to cover up all of your weak points. It's also good to pick ones that you have a bunch of bonuses for to having them, because those bonuses are very nice and make it so you can be these beings for much longer. There is not technically a best one, but there is a highest level one, and that is obviously the greatest hero in Anima, Holst. And he is just ridiculous, obviously. But it's up to you how you want to go through these. They are very much so. They're very much so based on what you're going to go with and what level you are. And yeah, they're very cool. Finally, we get the Sheely spirits. Sheely spirits are like familiars, but they're different. They are reflections of your very own soul. And they allow you to have a summoner of having a spirit basically without so not having a spirit, but having familiar without having to like research a specific creature. So to summon a Sheely, it has the same requirements as summoning a being of the summoner's level +1 and costs 10 times the normal amount of Xeon. If you're calling it for someone else, then it's +2 in level. And the cost must be fully paid by both the summoner and the other person. The way it kind of works is you summon forth the Sheely, and your soul provides the essence for the Sheely to become born. After you summon it, you must immediately attempt to bind it because you're making it familiar. So however, it follows the same rules as prior. So +1 and +2 level thing if you're summoning for yourself or someone else, and 10 times the Xeon cost. Also, when you do this, you lose one. You spend a point of power forever to bind it to your soul. However, this Sheely is obviously completely 100% loyalty because it's made from your soul. Now, generally, you would just roll for your type of Sheely, light, air, essence, earth, elementals, basically. But I would recommend as a DM, let your player pick based on their character. Because if their character is light aligned and they get a dark aligned Sheely, that's dumb, right? Now there are some situations where this is cool. Oh, sorry, I misinformed you. You don't need to make a Sheely your familiar, but when you do so, it makes it more difficult, but you get extra powers for doing so. Keeping the Sheely follows the same rules. However, if you can't pay the cost, you lose presence points. -10 to presence and all action points. And if its presence hits 0, it dies irreversibly. And if you start paying the penalties before it dies, you can undo them, obviously. Keep in mind though, if your Sheely does die from you not paying the Xeon and it fading away, you lose another power point on top of the one you spent to get it. So don't lose your Sheely. Sheelys have their own stats and powers and secondary abilities that you can make use of. You can, like a familiar, channel your supernatural powers through a Sheely. Uh, and you can choose how much of your MA you do to cast a spell through a Sheely. So you could give your Sheely the full breadth of your MA to cast a big spell, or you give it a small amount. You can also spend Xeon to give your Sheely extra ability. I'm just rereading this, make sure up to. Okay. Okay, so the way it works is based on your control ability, you can spend Xeon, and for every point of Xeon you spend, uh, in dockets of +5s, you can give your Sheely a +5 to +20 bonus, for example, if your control is only 0 to 49. Your Sheely cannot be more than 300 feet from you. If it does get too far from you, it weakens and eventually dies unless you find it again. If your Sheely dies, because it's technically your soul, again, you lose that power point you lost when you summon it, and it's not possible to regenerate this one power you lost. If you have the gift, you temporarily have your magical powers reduced heavily, -3 DMA, which is bad. And generally, when you die, the Sheely dies, generally. But sometimes they don't die and become their own being. It depends on how powerful the Sheely was. Generally, Sheelys fight with spells or powers, using their magical protection. And what they can do is if you're near your Sheely, you can pick which one defends both of you, whether it's a Sheely or you. It's up to you. Sheelys have their own personalities. They are just like normal familiars, and they are generally up to the DM on how they will act around you. Now, uh, now when you summon the Sheely, it gets special points to get these improvements per level that you have. And if the Sheely is your familiar, you get to pick 2 more for free. So that's your +1 benefit for making it your familiar. And these are all just buffs. One of them is Soul Form, which lets your Sheely go like super awesome form. Also, boobs, watch out. And you can improve generally Soul Form as well independently. Soul Form is really cool, but you don't need it. But it lets your Sheely become far more powerful and a lot more effective. you can give other enhancements that generally improve the stats. Now, there are plenty of varieties of Sheely, and they all have their own set base stats when they are summoned, and a general idea of their basic personality. And each specific kind of Sheely has its own special improvements it can pick. And these are just giving it special attacks and abilities. They will generally cost Xeon, but it allows you to more specialize your Sheely. There's one for every element. There is air, water, and all the usual stuff. There is no best Sheely, especially when you consider that generally you're going to get them at random. But there are plenty of Sheely that are very, but every Sheely is very useful. Uh, I recommend looking through them and working with your GM to find the one that you feel fits your character best. Beyond that, keep in mind that when it comes to a summoner, it's best to specialize in the kind of summoning field that you would like to go with. It would be a very poor idea to go into multiple fields that are conflicting and could cause you to become a weaker character. But now that we've talked about Sheelies, we've talked about everything there is to talk about when it comes to actual summoning. So I think this is a great place to end the video. And next time, we might talk a bit more about magic in general, or perhaps mentalism, which is also covered in this book. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was informative in explaining how summoning works and how you might want to build a summoning character. And I hope you guys give the Summoner a shot. They're a fun class, and they are very powerful. But like anything that's powerful, it comes with high risk, with higher rewards. In Anima Beyond Fantasy, anyways. So if you enjoy the video, you know the usual crap. Like, comment, subscribe, tell your mother. And let me know if there's anything if you have any questions, feel free to leave comments, and I will answer them as soon as I humanly can. And yeah, I will see y'all next time.